Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Shadow Storyteller. Before we begin tonight's tale, don't forget to subscribe, leave a like, and share your thoughts in the comments so you won't miss any of our late night stories before bed. Now, turn off the lights, settle in, and let the voice carry you into the shadows. The last broadcast from station 103.9 FM. It was a warm October night in 1997 in the small desert town of Winslow, Arizona. The sky was cloudless, the air still, carried with a faint scent of dust and sagebrush. Inside a dimly lit booth at the edge of town, David Keller, a 42-year-old radio host, prepared for his usual midnight shift on station 103.9 FM. The station was nothing glamorous, just a squat brick building off Route 87, its glowing red sign humming faintly in the night. David had been on the air for nearly 15 years, hosting Desert Nights, a late-night program where lonely truck drivers, sleepless locals, and night owls called in to share stories, dedications, or strange experiences they claimed to witness in the Arizona desert. That night, just after the clock ticked past 12:15 a.m., the switchboard lit up with familiar amber glow. David leaned forward, his chair creaking under him, and pressed a line. Station 103.9 FM, this is David. You're on the air. At first, only static filled the line, crackling, sharp, like the desert wind forcing its way into broadcast. Then came a voice, a woman's. "David, can you hear me?" Her tone was low, uncertain, almost trembling. David frowned. "Yes, you're live. Who am I speaking with tonight?" The silence stretched a moment too long before the answer came. "My name is Claire Halloway." The name tugged at something in the back of David's mind, though he couldn't place it. He tried to lighten the moment, his radio smile slipping into his voice. "Well, Claire, welcome to Desert Nights. Where are you calling from?" Another pause. Then, in a hushed voice, "I'm calling from Willow Creek Road, but I shouldn't be here." David sat up straighter, his eyes flicking to the clock above the glass window of the studio. 12:18 a.m. The mention of Willow Creek Road sent a chill crawling down his arms. That stretch of highway, just 15 miles outside Winslow, had been closed for over a decade after a flash flood washed away half the bridge. Nobody lived out there anymore. He cleared his throat, trying to keep his voice steady. "I'm sorry. Did you say Willow Creek Road? That area has been abandoned for years." "Yes," Claire whispered. "I know. That's why I shouldn't exist." The static surged louder, swallowing the edges of her words. David's producer, a young intern named Mark, glanced up from the control board, eyebrows raised. David waved him off, pretending everything was fine, but his pulse had already quickened. "Claire, what do you mean by that? Are you in some kind of trouble?" For a moment, nothing came through but the hiss of interference. Then the voice returned, softer now, as though carried by the desert wind itself. "They don't want me speaking, but I had to call. I used to listen to your voice every night, David. In 1987, do you remember the storm that year? The flood that took the bridge?" David's throat went dry. He remembered it clearly. August 14th, 1987. He had been on air that very night, reporting live warnings as the storm ripped through Willow Creek. Dozens of homes were lost. Several lives, too. "Yes," he said carefully. "I was on the air then." "I was there," Claire said, her voice cracking. "I died there." Mark's hand froze over the soundboard, eyes widening as the words echoed through the tiny booth. David's fingers tightened around the microphone stand, a film of sweat forming on his forehead. And then something strange happened. Through the glass window behind the studio, the desert seemed to flicker. For the briefest second, David thought he saw headlights stretching across the empty road, swaying like ghosts in the distance. He shook his head, heart pounding. "Claire, are you saying you're..." The line erupted with a piercing screech, forcing David to rip off his headphones. Mark cursed under his breath, frantically trying to stabilize the signal. But beneath the noise, just barely audible, Claire's voice pushed through. "They're coming!" And then the line went dead. The studio was silent, save for the faint hum of the equipment. David stared at the lifeless switchboard, its amber light no longer glowing. Mark finally broke the silence. "What the hell was that?" he whispered. But David didn't answer. His gaze was fixed on the window, on the desert beyond. Because this time, the headlights weren't flickers. They were real. Two pale beams moving slowly down the abandoned road that should have been passable for the last 10 years. David Keller sat frozen in his chair, the studio air suddenly colder, as though the desert itself had crept through the cracks in the old brick walls. The faint hum of the transmitter filled the silence, a low vibration that seemed louder than ever in that moment. Mark, the intern, shifted uneasily in his seat, still staring at the darkened phone line, as though willing it to light up again. "Dave, did you see that?" Mark whispered, pointing toward the narrow studio window that overlooked the scrubland beyond. David hesitated. His instinct screamed at him to say no, to brush it off as glare or fatigue. But he had seen it. Two pale headlights cutting across the road that no longer existed, the road that had been washed away a decade earlier. Slowly, he nodded. "Yeah," he said, voice hoarse. "I saw it." The two of them sat in uneasy silence, the glow of the console bathing their faces in sickly yellow light. Outside, the desert stretched endlessly, dark and silent, save for the occasional hiss of wind against the sand. The clock on the wall read 12:27 a.m. David reached for his coffee, now cold, his hand trembling slightly. He wasn't a man easily rattled. 15 years in late-night radio had hardened him against prank calls, ghost stories, and lonely drifters spinning wild tales to pass the time. But this was different. There had been something in Claire's voice, something raw and fractured, that no prankster could fake. And the way the line had shrieked, the way the desert had seemed to flicker as though it, too, were listening, none of that was a stunt. Mark broke the silence again, his voice quieter this time. "Dave, did she say she died? Back in '87? David swallowed hard, his throat dry. "Yeah, she did." For a long moment, they both stared at the switchboard. Then, with a sudden burst of determination, David flipped the switch and leaned into Mike. "This is Desert Nights on 103.9 FM. If you're just tuning in, you may have heard our last caller, Claire. She said her name was. If you're still out there, Claire, or if anyone knows a Claire Halloway from Willow Creek Road, call us back. We're here." He let the words hang in the air, his voice steady though his palms were slick with sweat. The line remained dark. But outside the window, the headlights grew brighter. They weren't moving like a car should, smooth and steady. Instead, they bobbed, dipped, swayed unnaturally, as though something unseen carried them across uneven ground. David rubbed his eyes, but when he looked again, they were still there, inching closer to the station. Mark rose from his chair, pressing his face to the glass. "Dave, that's not possible. There's nothing out there." David forced himself to keep the broadcast going, though his voice wavered. "Folks, if you're listening tonight, maybe you've heard rumors about Willow Creek Road. It's been closed for 10 years now, ever since the storm. Some of you out there might even remember the flood. Homes destroyed, people lost. Tonight we got a call from someone claiming to be there. Someone who shouldn't be. And now," he trailed off, realizing he was about to admit live on air what he and Mark were seeing. He stopped himself. "No, not yet." Mark turned toward him, face pale. "We can't just sit here, Dave. What if someone really is out there? What if they're stranded?" David glanced at the clock again. 12:32. The broadcast still had hours to go, but suddenly, being alone in that booth felt unbearable. He cleared his throat. "All right," he muttered. "We'll check it out after the next song." He queued up a track, something soft and haunting, a late-night guitar piece that only seemed to make the silence between them heavier. Then he switched the mic off and stood. The studio door creaked as they pushed it open, stepping into the narrow hallway that led toward the back exit. The air smelled faintly of dust and ozone, the way it always did when the transmitter hummed at full power. Outside, the desert night pressed close. The stars overhead were brilliant, endless, but offered no comfort. The headlights had stopped now, fixed just beyond the fence that circled the station lot. Two pale orbs motionless, watching. Mark whispered, "Do you hear that?" David held his breath. Yes. Beneath the whisper of wind, there was something else, a faint rhythmic sound, like water dripping onto stone. Impossible in this dry night, yet it was there, steady and insistent. He forced himself forward, gravel crunching under his boots. "Hello," he called into the dark. His voice carried, thin against a vast emptiness. "Is someone out there?" No reply. The lights wavered once, like candles flickering in a sudden gust, then vanished altogether. The desert was dark again. Mark swore under his breath, gripping David's arm. "We need to go back inside. Now!" David wanted to argue, to say it was nothing more than his tired eyes playing tricks. But deep down, he knew better. Something was happening here. Something tied to that call, to that name. They retreated quickly, slamming the heavy studio door behind them. Inside, the air felt heavier, thick with static. The moment David put his headphones back on, he realized why. The line had lit up again. He pressed it without hesitation. "Station 103.9 FM. Claire? Is that you?" The voice that answered was barely more than a whisper, broken by bursts of static. "David, they know you heard me. You shouldn't have answered." David's pulse hammered in his chest. "Who are they?" he asked, his voice sharper than before. For a moment, nothing. Then the sound came, not words, but something else. A chorus of voices, layered and distorted, whispering all at once. Too many to count. Too many to understand. Mark's hand shot to the soundboard, trying to kill the feed, but David stopped him. "Wait," he said, eyes fixed on the console. "Let it play." The whispers swelled, growing louder, until they filled the studio like a storm. The walls seemed to tremble, the very air vibrating with their force. And then, clearer than all the rest, one word emerged. "Run." The line went dead again. Silence crashed back over them. David ripped off his headphones, chest heaving. Mark stared at him, wide-eyed. "What the hell is going on, Dave?" David didn't answer right away. Instead, he turned toward the window again, because the lights had returned. And this time, they weren't headlights. They were shapes, pale, human-like forms, dozens of them, standing just beyond the fence line, motionless, watching. David's hand trembled above the switchboard. 5 amber lights blinked in unison, casting a sickly glow across the studio. It wasn't possible. In 15 years on the air, he had never seen all lines activate at once, especially not at this hour. There weren't even that many listeners awake in Winslow at 1 o'clock in the morning. Mark stood rigid beside him, his voice sharp, panicked. "Don't do it, Dave. Don't answer. It's not callers, you know it's not." But something deeper than curiosity pulled at David, an invisible thread winding tighter around his chest. He had heard their voices already, desperate, pleading, angry. If he didn't answer, the silence would haunt him more than any sound. Slowly, deliberately, he pressed the first line. The air split open with noise. Not static this time. Not distortion. It was water, rushing, crashing, roaring as though a river had burst through the studio walls. David ripped his headset half off, but kept one earpiece pressed to his ear, forcing himself to listen. Within the roar, voices emerged. Dozens of them, layered and overlapping, crying out names, prayers, fragments of last words. It was chaos given sound. The storm of 87 resurrected on a single phone line. Mark shook his head violently. Hang it up, Dave. But David's fingers slid to the second line, pressing it down. The flood was joined by something else. Children. Faint, high-pitched laughter that should have been innocent, but wasn't. The laughter was strained, cut short by gasps for air, turning into choked sobs. It rose and fell like waves themselves, filling the studio with an unbearable weight. David's stomach twisted. He remembered the reports, the families caught on the wrong side of the bridge, the children swept away, names read solemnly at town meetings, names he had once spoken into his microphone, asking for donations, condolences, prayers. He pressed the third line. A woman's voice cut through, louder than the rest, clear, strong, echoing with the distortion of the dead. You let us drown. David's throat closed. He knew it wasn't true. He had been on the air, begging people to leave. But to them, it hadn't mattered. His voice hadn't reached fast enough. His warnings had been too late. Mark grabbed his wrist. Stop it. You're letting them in. David yanked his arm free and pressed the fourth line. The studio shook. The lights overhead flickered wildly, buzzing like insects. A man's voice thundered through the speakers, low and guttural, carrying a rage that felt ancient. You broadcast, but you never listened. Now you hear us. David staggered back, headset slipping from his ear. The console glowed with unnatural heat. The amber lights burning brighter than bulbs should allow. He could smell ozone, sharp and metallic, like lightning striking far too close. Then the fifth line engaged on its own. David hadn't touched it. The studio fell silent. For a long moment, there was nothing. No static, no flood, no voices. Just a hollow quiet, pressing against her eardrums like the air before a storm. Then Claire spoke. David. Her voice was calm now, almost tender. He leaned into the mic, his own voice shaking. Claire, I'm here. You remember us, she said softly. That's why you can hear. You carried us all these years, even when you didn't know it. Every night you spoke into the dark. You called to us, and now we've answered. David's hands trembled. What do you want me to do? Tell them, Claire whispered. Tell them the truth about Willow Creek, about what happened, about what they never buried. Mark's eyes widened. What is she talking about? David's mind whirled. He remembered the flood, the collapsed bridge, the homes lost. But there was something else, wasn't there? Something he had forgotten, or maybe something he had been made to forget. He had reported what officials told him at the time. A natural disaster, a flash flood, a tragedy no one could stop. But Claire's voice carried a different weight. They knew, she said, her tone sharp now, accusing. The town, the council, they knew the dam was failing. They knew the bridge was weak. They knew, and they did nothing. Mark shook his head furiously. That's crazy. If that were true, everyone would know. It would have been all over the papers. No, Claire said, her voice rising. They buried it, just like they buried us. The flood sounds returned faintly in the background, mingled with whispers and choked cries. David felt the room closing in on him, the studio shrinking under the weight of a truth too large to contain. Claire, he managed. How do I prove it? The line hissed. Then came a reply, cold and final. Go back to Willow Creek. See what they left behind. The line went dead. David stared at the console. Every light now extinguished. Outside, The desert stretched silent once more. No figures. No headlights. Just the wind stirring sand across the barren road. Mark slammed his hands on the desk. We're not going out there. Dave, don't even think about it. We stay here until sunrise. Then we forget this ever happened. But David couldn't forget. The pull in his chest grew stronger with every breath. The need to know gnawing at him like hunger. The clock read 1:37 a.m. Still hours until dawn. He turned to Mark, his decision clear in his eyes. I have to go. Mark shook his head violently. You'll get yourself killed. Or worse. Then stay here, David said. He grabbed his jacket from the back of his chair, slipping it on with shaking hands. But I have to see it. The studio door creaked open again, the desert air rushing in, dry and sharp. David stepped out, gravel crunching beneath his boots, the stars above brilliant and endless. Willow Creek lay 15 miles away, a stretch of abandoned road, a broken bridge, and, if Claire was right, secrets buried beneath 10 years of silence. David slid into his car, the old engine coughing to life. As he pulled out of the lot, headlights carving through the darkness, he glanced in the rear-view mirror. For the briefest second, he saw her, a woman in the back seat, pale and wet, her eyes fixed on him. Then the mirror blinked empty. David gripped the wheel tighter, his breath ragged. The road stretched ahead, long and lonely, leading toward the ruins of Willow Creek. Behind him, the red glow of station 103.9 FM faded into the night. But on the airwaves, across radios and dark kitchens and lonely truck stops, static carried a faint sound, a woman's voice whispering the same name again and again. David, David, David. The desert listened. The night held its breath. And Willow Creek waited. The night dragged on, though Alan hardly noticed how quickly time had bled away. The fluorescent lights in the small broadcast booth flickered faintly, buzzing with that mechanical hum that filled the silence between songs. The Arizona desert outside was still yet restless. Wind pressed against the windows like invisible hands, carried with a faint scent of dust and dry creosote. Station 103.9 FM wasn't supposed to feel haunted. It was just a low-frequency local channel, barely hanging on, its funding thin, its audience mostly truckers, lonely farmers, and the occasional insomniac student. Alan had worked there for years, and though the job didn't pay much, it gave him what he craved, connection. The midnight show was his favorite, when the phone lines opened and strangers poured their hearts into the static. But tonight, the calls were different. He sat in front of the microphone, palms sweating despite the chill in the room. The blinking red light indicated another call coming through. He cleared his throat, masking his unease with the practiced calm of a seasoned host. Station 103.9, this is Alan. You're on the air. Who's speaking? For a moment, there was only static, the kind that felt alive, like whispering just beyond the range of human hearing. Then a voice seeped through, low and wavering. You shouldn't be there, Alan. The hairs rose on the back of his neck. He recognized the voice. It was the same one from earlier night, the same one that had repeated his name, slowly, syllable by syllable, like an incantation. But according to phone log, the call was coming from a disconnected line. Alan forced a chuckle, his mouth dry. All right, friend, do you have a name? A message to the folks out there listening tonight. The silence stretched too long. Then the voice returned. They're already listening. They're behind you. Alan's breath caught. He swiveled in his chair, the leather creaking. The booth was empty, just racks of equipment, shelves of CDs, and a smudged glass window looking into the corridor beyond. No one was there. No shadows moved. Yet the pressure in the room seemed heavier, as if unseen company had indeed joined him. He turned back to the mic. Very funny. A little late-night prank, huh? Static hissed in reply, followed by a sound he couldn't mistake. The distinct creak of the booth door. But the door hadn't moved. He could see it closed tight. Still, the sound repeated, louder, dragging across his eardrums like something opening in a place his eyes could not reach. Alan's hands trembled as he muted the line, switching instead to a track, a soft guitar ballad, something harmless to fill the airwaves while he gathered himself. The music floated out, but he could still hear the caller faintly, as though the voice wasn't coming to the phone anymore, but bleeding directly into the room. Alan, you left me there. You don't even remember, do you? He staggered back from the desk, heart hammering. Left who? Left where? The words cut deeper because they weren't just threats. They felt personal, like a shard of memory he couldn't quite piece together. At 2:37 a.m., the log showed the line still active, though the board confirmed it shouldn't be. The name displayed on the screen flickered repeatedly. Caller unknown. Then, for the briefest instant, the system rendered a location. Alan leaned forward, eyes widening. It wasn't an address. It was coordinates. Latitude and longitude. And he recognized them. About 15 miles south of Tucson, near a stretch of desert where an old drive-in theater once stood. He hadn't been there in nearly 20 years. Not since a night in 1998, when something happened that he had tried, with every ounce of will, to bury. Alan stumbled back into his chair, sweat beading across his forehead. He tried to steady his breathing. His mind screamed at him to end the broadcast, cut the line, shut the place down and go home. Yet another part of him, some quiet pulled deep in his chest, whispered that he had to keep listening, because the caller wasn't just anyone. The caller knew. He opened the line again, his voice shaky. Why now? Why after all these years? The reply was instant and colder than the desert air outside. Because you promised you'd come back, and you never did. The studio lights dimmed, flickered, then flared. Alan slapped the console, panic cutting through his professionalism. He reached for his water bottle, but his hand froze when he saw the condensation forming along the outside plastic. The booth was freezing now, colder than any Arizona night should have been. Behind him, the window into the corridor clouded as if breath fogged the other side. Alan didn't want to look, but his eyes betrayed him. There was something moving just beyond the glass. A faint outline, a face pressed close, its mouth open in a soundless scream. The caller laughed then, the sound distorted, layered, as if several voices echoed through one throat. The board lights flared red, all lines active at once. Dozens of calls, dozens of unknown numbers flashing, though there was only silence on each channel. Then, all at once, they spoke in unison. Alan! 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 His stomach lurched. He yanked the headphones off, but the voices didn't fade. They were in the room, crawling out of the static, wrapping around his name like a net. Alan collapsed back into his chair, clutching the armrests, mind racing. The desert was quiet tonight, but inside the booth, it felt like every ghost that had ever been silenced was crowding in, demanding to be heard. And somehow, impossibly, they all knew his name. The clock struck 3 a.m., the witching hour, and the broadcast continued. The red light on the console glowed like a burning eye, unblinking, watching Alan as his pulse thundered in his ears. His throat was dry. Every attempt to swallow felt like dragging sandpaper down his windpipe. He rubbed his palms against his jeans, trying to ground himself in the present moment. But the voices still whisper at the edge of hearing, like insects crawling beneath the skin of the world. He tried to speak, to resume his role as calm midnight host, but when he leaned into the microphone, his own voice sounded foreign. You're listening to 103.9 FM. This is Alan, and his words trailed into silence. He couldn't finish the sentence. The studio didn't feel like his anymore. The clock ticked past 3:05 a.m. The air conditioning unit rattled once and fell silent, leaving a heavy, unnatural stillness. Then, from somewhere deep in the station, a faint metallic thud echoed down the corridor, followed by another, closer this time, as though someone or something was dragging a chair across the floor. Alan's mind raced. He was alone. The night engineer, a college kid named Ryan, had left hours earlier after finishing his shift. No one else should be here. Yet the sound was unmistakable. Furniture moving. He told himself it was the building settling, old pipes creaking, but his gut refused to believe it. He glanced at the phone log again. The coordinates still blinked faintly, burning themselves into his memory. He could see the old drive-in in his mind, the broken screen rising like a tombstone against the night sky. He remembered the heat of that summer night in 1998, the laughter of his friends, and then the silence that followed. Another thud snapped him back. This one came from directly outside the booth door. Alan froze, breath locked in his chest. The doorknob rattled once, gently, as though someone was testing it. Then nothing, just the hum of the console and the faint static leaking from the speakers. His instinct screamed to run. But if he ran, where would he go? The station was isolated on the edge of town, surrounded by miles of desert. He would be stepping into a sea of darkness, with no one to help if whatever was outside decided to follow. Instead, he forced himself to stay seated, eyes fixed on the door. His hand trembled as he reached for the switchboard, unmuting one of the active lines. Station 103.9, this is Alan, he said, his voice breaking. Who's out there? The answer came instantly, layered in that same distorted echo. You know who I am. Alan's vision blurred. He felt lightheaded, as if the booth itself was spinning. The voice was more familiar now. No longer just eerie static, but almost recognizable. A memory scratched at the edge of his consciousness, of a boy's voice calling out across the desert years ago, when they were young and reckless. No, Alan whispered to himself. It's not possible. The line crackled. We waited for you, Alan, but you ran. You left me behind. The studio lights dimmed again, plunging the room into near darkness. Only the glow of the console illuminated Alan's pale face. His reflection in the glass seemed wrong, the angles of his features distorted, as if another face was pushing up beneath his own. He shut his eyes, counted to 3, then forced them open. The face was gone, but the feeling of being watched was stronger than ever. The calls kept pouring in. Every line flashed, blinking faster, until it felt like the board was about to explode. He muted them all in desperation, but even without the speakers, he could still hear the voices chanting his name. At 3:22 a.m., the power flickered. The station went silent for a heartbeat. Then the emergency backup generator kicked in with a groan. Alan's headphones crackled. Though he hadn't put them back on, a whisper slipped through. Come back to the desert, Alan. We'll be waiting. His body shook uncontrollably. He tore the headphones off and shoved them aside, his chair screeching against the floor as he stood. He could no longer sit trapped inside this booth. He needed air, even if it meant stepping into the corridor. He pushed the door open. The hallway stretched ahead, dimly lit by a single flickering bulb. The walls, usually sterile and plain, seemed to pulse with shadows that shifted when he blinked. Far down the hall, one of the doors stood slightly ajar. Alan forced himself forward, his footsteps echoing too loudly, as though the building itself was amplifying his presence. He reached the open door. It was Ryan's engineering room. Inside, monitors glowed faintly, displaying the broadcast frequency. But something was wrong. The waveform dancing across the screen wasn't normal audio. It looked jagged, broken, like a heartbeat spiking irregularly. And in the corner of the room, The old landline phone was off the hook. Alan approached it slowly, dread coiling in his stomach. He lifted the receiver to his ear. On the other end, the same voice whispered, "Do you remember July 17th, 1998? Alan's knees buckled. His grip on the phone tightened as a flood of memories surged. The desert heat, the laughter of his high school friends, the dare that had sent them out to the old drive-in theater. The screen had already been abandoned, its concrete base cracked, the lot filled with weeds. They'd gone there to drink, to tell ghost stories, to prove they weren't afraid. But something had happened that night. Something Alan had forced himself to forget. He heard his younger self screaming, the sound buried beneath layers of denial. He remembered running, his shoes sinking into the sand, leaving someone behind. And now, after 27 years, that someone had found his way back. Alan slammed the receiver down, chest heaving. He stumbled backward, knocking into a chair. The monitors flared white, and for a split second, a face appeared on the screen. Pale, hollow-eyed, mouth frozen in an eternal scream. Then it vanished. Alan bolted back down the corridor into the broadcast booth. He slammed the door shut and locked it, though some rational part of him knew a lock would make no difference against whatever force was taunting him. The console crackled again. Without touching the switchboard, a new voice broke through. Not distorted, not layered, but heartbreakingly clear. "Alan, why didn't you come back for me?" Tears stung his eyes. He didn't want to admit it, but he knew the name now. He whispered it into the microphone, though his voice cracked like old wood. "David." The line went dead. Silence returned, heavier than before. The clock ticked to 3:45 a.m. Alan sat frozen in his chair, gripping the mic like a lifeline. He knew the truth now. The voice wasn't just some prank caller or ghost story bleeding through the static. It was David, his childhood friend, the one he'd abandoned at that drive-in theater decades ago. And David wanted him back. The studio lights flickered once more. Outside the booth in the corridor, footsteps echoed slowly, steadily, moving closer with each passing second. Alan didn't dare move. He didn't dare breathe. The last broadcast station, 103.9 FM, was far from over. The footsteps outside the booth stopped. Alan held his breath, staring at the bottom edge of the door, where a sliver of dim yellow light from the corridor leaked in. For several seconds, there was nothing. Then, as if someone crouched on the other side, a shadow passed across the thin line of light. Slow, deliberate. Alan's grip on the microphone tightened until his knuckles whitened. He couldn't speak. He couldn't even force himself to cough or move the chair. The air in the booth felt heavy, as if filled with unseen weight pressing against his chest. The clock read 3:53 a.m. The shadow lingered. Then came the sound, a low whisper, not through the phone line this time, not through the speakers, but seeping through the very door. "Alan." His stomach twisted. It wasn't just the voice of a stranger. It wasn't even the distorted tone from earlier. It was the voice of David, clear and unbroken, just as Alan remembered it from that summer long ago. The door handle rattled once, gently, almost politely, as though asking permission to enter. Alan stood, his chair screeching against the floor, and backed away toward the far corner of the booth. He wanted to shout, to tell it him to go away, but the words caught in his throat. The handle stopped moving. Silence returned, stretching out for long seconds, until Alan's ears rang. Then, faintly, from the console speakers, music began to play, but he hadn't cued anything. It was a song Alan hadn't heard in 27 years. A cassette tape David used to carry everywhere. A track by a local garage band no one else remembered, their voices tinny and raw. The melody was cracked and warped now, as if the tape had been left too long in the desert sun. Alan collapsed into his chair, burying his face in his hands. His mind screamed at him to leave the station, drive as far as he could, but something deeper, something colder inside whispered the truth. He couldn't run again. He had already done that once. And David had followed him all these years, through static, through silence, waiting. The phone rang. One line, then another, then all of them again, flashing red like a warning siren. Alan reached forward with trembling fingers and picked up the first. No greeting, just breathing. He switched to the second. The same. By the fifth, the breathing gave way to words. "Come back to the desert, Alan." His chest tightened. He dropped the receiver as if it had burned him. The words echoed inside the booth anyway, bouncing off the walls at command he couldn't resist. At 4:07 a.m., Alan made his decision. He couldn't sit inside this haunted station any longer. If he wanted it to stop, if he wanted to end this torment, he would have to go back to where it all started. He grabbed his jacket from the back of the chair, shoved his car keys into his pocket, and turned toward the door. His hand froze on the knob, terrified that when he opened it, something would be waiting. The knob felt icy under his palm. He twisted it slowly, pushed the door open, and stepped into the corridor. The hallway stretched empty, lit only by that flickering bulb. Yet the air smelled faintly of smoke, like a campfire long extinguished. Alan's chest ached. He remembered that smell. July 17th, 1998. They had lit a small fire in a rusted tin barrel, laughing as sparks rose toward the torn white canvas of the drive-in screen. He forced himself forward, each step echoing too loudly. The front door of the station loomed ahead, its glass panels reflecting his pale, drawn face. Behind his reflection, for just an instant, he thought he saw another figure, standing inches behind him. He spun around. Nothing. Alan pushed through the door and stepped into the night. The desert air hit him like a wall, cool and dry, carrying the endless emptiness of miles around. The station's parking lot was deserted. The only car is old silver sedan. Above, the sky stretched wide, littered with stars, but bank of clouds crawled across the horizon, blotting out the moon. Alan slid into the driver's seat, hands shaking as he turned the key. The engine coughed, then roared to life. He gripped the wheel, trying to steady his breath. He told himself this was insane, that he shouldn't drive into the desert at 4 a.m. chasing ghosts. But the voice had left him no choice. The coordinates burned in his mind, guiding him like a curse. The tires crunched against gravel as he pulled onto the road. The station fell behind him, its lone sign glowing faintly in the rearview mirror until even that disappeared into the dark. The highway stretched ahead, empty. The asphalt cracked and faded. Alan drove south. The desert blurred past, dotted with saguaros and low scrub. The headlights carved a narrow tunnel through night, and outside that tunnel, shadows seemed to keep pace with his car, flickering just at the edge of sight. At 4:38 a.m., his radio crackled to life. He hadn't turned it on. The dial was still set to 103.9, but no song was playing, just static, rising and falling like the tide. Then, through the static, a voice whispered, "You're almost here." Alan gritted his teeth, gripping the wheel tighter. He didn't reply. He couldn't. The road narrowed, breaking away from the highway into a dirt track. Alan followed it, the tires bumping over stones. Ahead, faint against the dark horizon, he saw it, the skeleton of the old drive-in theater. The giant screen still stood, torn and weathered, leaning slightly to one side like a gravestone half swallowed by the desert. The lot was filled with weeds and broken concrete, rusted metal poles, one speakers for parked cars, jutted from the earth like the bones of forgotten giants. Alan parked at the edge, his headlights cutting across the cracked asphalt. Dust rose around the car, swirling the beams like smoke. He killed the engine, Silence fell heavy. For a long moment, he sat frozen, staring at the ruin of the theater. Memories pressed against his skull like fists, demanding to be let in. The laughter of his friends, the clink of beer bottles, the way David had dared him to climb the screen, the way the night had turned. Alan forced the door open. His shoes crunched on gravel as he stepped out. The desert stretched endless and empty around him, yet he felt watched from every angle. The air here was colder, unnaturally so. His breath clouded in front of him, though it wasn't nearly cold enough for that. He walked forward, each step echoing against the silence. As he neared the base of the screen, he saw something, a dark shape, slumped against one of the rusted poles. His chest seized. He knew what it was before he reached it, though his mind rebelled. It was a chair, an old folding chair, the kind they had brought with them that night, and on it lay a cassette player, covered in dust. Alan bent down, trembling, and brushed it clean. The tape inside was labeled in smeared ink, July 17th. The moment his fingers touched the play button, the night exploded with sound. Voices poured from the empty lot. Laughter, shouts, fragments of music, overlapping like a recording of the past replayed into the present. He staggered back, clutching his ears. Then, cutting through the chaos, David's voice rang clear. "You left me, Alan." Alan collapsed to his knees. Tears blurred his vision. He remembered now. David had climbed the screen, laughing, daring Alan to follow. Alan had started after him, but then the canvas had torn. David had fallen, his scream echoing across the lot, ending in a sickening silence. Alan had panicked. He had run, left David there, broken in the desert, and David had never forgiven him. The ground beneath Alan trembled faintly, like something stirring beneath the earth. The voices grew louder, surrounding him, pressing in until the night felt alive with shadows. Alan screamed, the sound swallowed by the desert. At 5:02 a.m., the first light of dawn touched the horizon, but Alan wasn't sure he would live to see the sun rise. The desert was silent when the sun finally rose above the jagged horizon. The first rays of light spilled across the abandoned drive-in, painting the torn screen in hues of pale gold. But Alan was gone. His car sat at the edge of the lot, the driver's side door left ajar. Keys still in the ignition. The cassette player remained on the folding chair, tape spinning endlessly in its chamber, though no sound came out. Only the faint hiss of static, steady and unbroken. Back at station 103.9 FM, the broadcast continued. The empty booth hummed with life, as though unseen hands worked the board. The red light glowed steadily, and through radios across the Arizona desert, a voice whispered. Not Alan's voice. Not anymore. It was David's. "Good morning, listeners." The voice said softly, carried on a frequency like a ghost in the wires. "This is station 103.9, and I'll be here with you forever." The music that followed was warped, like a song recorded from another world. Listeners swore later. They heard cries woven beneath the melody, the desperate sound of a man calling out from somewhere he could not escape. Alan's name. Those who tuned in that morning said they changed the station as fast as they could, unsettled by what they'd heard. But some, just a few, kept listening, and they swore the voice on the radio spoke directly to them, calling them by name, urging them to come to the desert too. The station never officially shut down. It still exists, a lonely signal on the dial, faint and static-ridden. Most locals say it abandoned, the building empty for years. Yet if you drive late at night through the desert south of Tucson and tune your dial carefully, you just might catch it. Station 103.9 FM. The last broadcast never truly ended, and the desert is still waiting.